In today's show, we're looking at buy low trade targets for fantasy basketball. Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com and at Yahoo Sports Australia. And you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today we are looking at buy low players. These are, again, not an exhaustive list. It's 5 guys for category leagues, 5 guys for points leagues that we're taking a look at here. There's going to be other guys who are buy lows, but when we're talking buy low, it doesn't mean, hey, buy them at what their perceived value might end up at. It's if you can get them at a discount, you do it, because maybe they don't get to that level, but you give yourself 90 to 95% chance that you're going to be able to come out on top in a trade that you are pulling off for these guys. So I think it's an important thing. It's not go and get these guys at all costs. It's get them at the right price. Otherwise, just leave it. And the same goes with majority of transactions that you do in fantasy basketball. Let's start this off by talking about Devin Booker of the Phoenix Suns. It hasn't been a great start to the year for Booker. He is, what's he currently? Over the course of the season, he's the 56th ranked player, which is obviously not great. Now, normally when I do my buy lows and sell highs, I like to look at the last 2 weeks of production because that does give you a little bit more of an idea of recent form, and people are swayed by recent form in a pretty large way. So I think that's important. He's 60th over the last 2 weeks, 22 points only. But the thing that really stands out is he's shooting just 78% from the free throw line. And this is a guy that was at 92% last year. So there's your big drop-off already. The assists, I'm a bit worried that they're never coming back. He was at 6.5 last season, and now he's at 4.7. But what we can see trending in the right direction is over his last 3 games, he's back at 85% from the line. And that might get obscured in the narrative of him being a poor free throw shooter this year, but it is starting to trend in the correct direction. You start hitting those free throws at an extra 1 or 2 per game. So say he makes an extra 2 per game, then the 22 points goes to 24 points, and then we're getting a little bit closer to where we need to be. Now, I don't think he's probably going to reach the top 15 where he was last year. Maybe he gets back to being inside the top 40, perhaps. Maybe, but not necessarily. And I had someone ask me, do I trade Levine for Booker? And I'd say there's probably a 50-50 chance, or maybe even a larger than that chance, that Levine ends up being better than Booker this season. So while at the start of the season we would have said, yeah, for sure, you got to readjust your calibrations. And with the way that Paul and Booker are working together, it is sort of not necessarily going in Devin Booker's favor there. Next up, we look at the headmaster, Jamal Murray. Murray is the 63rd ranked player over the last 2 weeks. And I think, again, part of the reason we're looking at Murray because of him being a buy low is that over those last 2 weeks, he's shooting 78% from the free throw line. Another guy that was at 88% last season. He is averaging 20 points per game, but even over the last week, it's even dropped off further. 4 points per game for Jamal Murray in that 14 points per game for Jamal Murray and 46% shooting. So there is a trend downwards for him at the moment. Again, we're not expecting him to be bubble Murray. We're not expecting him even really to be top 50 Murray, but as the trend is going over the last week outside the top 100 is where he sits, that's obviously not an ideal scenario for us. Then there is some value in trading for him at this point and hoping that there's going to be some level of improvement over this course of this time, but mostly in that free throw percentage, getting that up, and that gives you from 20 points per game to 22, 23 points per game. So it is a double influencer, those percentage categories, as I mentioned quite a bit on the show. Trae Young, another guy who was picked comfortably in that first round at pick 9 in most formats, and he over the last 2 weeks is the 80th ranked player. That is obviously not living up to the expectations you would have had when you drafted him in the first round, so not ideal at all. for Trae. But is there hope for him to improve? Well, of course there is. Now, do I think he's going to go back to being a first-round guy? I'm a little bit doubtful on that at this point, but over the last 2 weeks, he's averaging still 21 points per game, but shooting an absolutely brutal 36% from the field. Now, he was a 44% shooter last year. He's shooting only 28% from three over the entire season, 7% from three in his last 3 games, and 22% over his last 7 games. We have a pretty high understanding that that's going to improve. His 2-point percentage is also off. Now, unlike Booker, his free throws are fine. His assists are basically where they need to be as well, in around that 8.5 to 9 zone. But the field goal percentage and the 3-point percentage is way off. He's also giving us half of the steals that he got last year, under half. He was almost a third of the steals. He was at 1.1 last year. He's at 0.4. You add the steals in, you add the threes coming back at volume. His 3-pointers made per game this year are under half of what they were last season. So the points will go up, the threes will go up, the steals will go up, the field goal percentage will go up, and therefore he will jump significantly. 80th ranked player over the last 2 weeks, Trae Young. De'Aaron Fox, another buy low option for us here. Fox, and then when we look at what he's done over the last 2 weeks, it's been relatively rough. And he did have an injury, a hamstring issue, which has suppressed his numbers. But when you go to sites and just perfunctorily, I don't think that's the right use of that word, but I'm going to use it because it sounds funny. When we look at rankings or player raters, it won't take into consideration the fact that one of those games he played 5 minutes. So it's going to skew his averages. Over the last, and that doesn't take away from the fact that he hasn't been good this year, 91st ranked player over the course of the season. Over the last 2 weeks, he's 93rd, averaging under 18 points per game. For recollection's sake, he averaged 21 points a game last year, but only 4.6 assists. Like, that's rough. This guy was at 21 and 7 last year. Like, he is way off the pace. Never been a good free throw shooter, but that's somehow got worse. 67% from the line. 24% from three, and nearly always when someone's underperforming, look at the percentages. And 3-point percentage, and again, for those of you new, it's a triple category influencer. Your 3-point percentage drops, you lose points, you lose 3-pointers made, and you lose field goal percentage. So you get that back up, and he's not a good 3-point shooter. He was 29% last year, right? 37 the year before that. But let's say he goes from 23, 24 back to 31, then it's still a significant upgrade. Plus, his 2-point percentage is fine, so that's a positive. We can get the free throws up a bit, but it's these assists that are just absolutely missing and the minutes that are low for De'Aaron Fox. So we're going to see those things all start to improve, and he pushes back to being a top 60, top 50 sort of a player, which for a guy that's currently ranked 90th, you'd hope for that improvement. The next guy we look at, Donovan Mitchell.
He's good.
Don Mitchell, he is starting to turn it around at the moment. We're seeing that trend in the right direction, but he is the 92nd ranked player over those last 2 weeks. This is a guy that many people drafted in the 20s. I think I had him in the mid to low 30s. Never been a top 40 player before. But we're starting to see it trend back around. And one thing we always want to pay attention to is free throw attempts. Now, in addition to his free throw attempts being lower than last year, his free throw percentage is at 74% over the last 8 games. He's shooting 43% from the field. That's not that dissimilar to last year. 36% from three. Again, almost exactly the same as last year. 5 assists. That's up from last year. But what has happened is that free throw attempt rate is down and the percentage is down in a long way. But the other thing we've got to look at is his steal rate went from 1 steal per game to 0.4 over the last 8 games and just 0.7 on the season. You get those numbers back, and you get an improvement in the free throw percentage. And no reason to think he's all of a sudden a terrible free throw shooter. All those things tie in together, and Mitchell goes back to being probably close to a top 50 player, which for a guy that is struggling the way that he is at the moment is going to be a significant win for you. Let's move across to points leagues now and take a squiz at some of those buy lows over there. Now, some of those guys are going to be the same. Trae Young is a points league buy low player. He is, over the last 2 weeks, the 47th ranked player, and he's averaging 36 fantasy points per game. He should be pushing 45, 46 realistically. So there is some room, and we've talked about why he's down already. Lonzo Ball is a points league buy low player in my mind. Lonzo is, I think, is struggling a little bit with some of his role in New Orleans, but 124th ranked player over the course of the season. Over the course of the last 2 weeks. He's 100th over the course of the season. I think he's like a top 80 player, probably at worst. Over those last 2 weeks, just under 24 fantasy points per game. He should be able to push to 30. Why is he so down? Well, the assists are low, just 4.5 assists per game, but one of the big strengths of Lonzo is his defensive numbers, and over the last 6 games, 0.3 steals. That's 2 steals in 6 games, and 0.5 blocks, when realistically, he can be a 1.5 and a 0.8 sort of a player, which it doesn't make a massive difference, but he could get a whole ass extra steal there, which is 3 points in default leagues, which takes him from 24 points per game up to 27 points per game. Those blocks can jump up. Yeah, not a huge amount, but they can jump up as well. He's also under rebounding. He was a 6 rebound per game player last year. He's down at 4 this year, so an extra 2 rebounds, an extra 2 to 3 points can come onto his scoring numbers, and then his overall fantasy output should be able to push back to close to that 30-point mark in my mind. Jim Butler, another player who there's many people really panicking about Butler. He is the 38th ranked player over the last 2 weeks. He's averaging 38.5 fantasy points during that time. I think he's a 40-plus player, so there is some scope for improvement. Over the last 2 weeks, only 30 minutes, 18.6 rebounds and 5 assists. I think his scoring will go up from there. I think he'll be able to push it to 20 points per game. And I think he's looked better because the last 3 games, he's the 14th ranked player, averaging 47 points. So, yeah, whether you can execute that as a buy low remains to be seen, but there is still some negative opinions around Butler and his performance this season. And I don't base this all just on numbers. It's about the copious YouTube comments and tweets and chat messages and Instagrams and Facebooks and Discords. I try and read as much as I can about the general state of opinions on players, and Butler's one of those ones that people are panicking on or wanting to sell off, and that's where you try and take advantage of it in those scenarios. De'Aaron Fox on this list as well. Talked about him already. He's the 59th ranked points league player, which is better than his category ranking, but he should be realistically a top 30 category guy, or top 30, points guy when he comes back. And the last guy we talk about, another Atlanta Hawks player, is Clint Capela, who is the 73rd ranked player over the last 2 weeks. I think he should be able to be a top 50 player. He's averaging just 26 minutes a night in the last 2 weeks, averaging under 10 points with 13 rebounds and only 1 block, which equates to 31 fantasy points per game. I think that scoring should be able to jump up. He's only at 10 points per game for the year. And this last 2 weeks is his entire production. Those scoring numbers should come up, but his block numbers, 1 block per game for Clint Capela. This is a guy that, since he became a regular full-time starter, has never averaged under 1.5 blocks. So there's room for that to come up. The rebounds are fine, and he's underscoring by about 4 to 5 points per game. So he should be a 35 to 36 fantasy point per game producer, and he's giving us 31. So that's probably a 30-40 ranking spot jump for Clint Capela when all is said and done. That'll do it for my show today, guys. I'll be back later on with the pre-game show at 6:30 p.m. Yeah, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, so check that out on YouTube. Subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and on the old YouTube. Hit the bell, give it a comment, give it a thumbs up, guys. We are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.